Good afternoon and welcome to the first of three modules regarding how to access the Green Homes grant. And in this one we're looking at the perhaps rather murky world of insulation product standards and what the implications of those standards are. I'm Jerry Miller. I work with the IAA as a consultant. Ron Fennig, the IAA's head of certification, will be joining me to co-present. There is a Q&A function on Teams, and if you can post any questions that come up, we'll review and go through those at the end. So this session is intended to look at the standards that apply to different insulation measures and the differing roles of manufacturers and suppliers under those standards. It's focused on the Green Homes grant, and you've probably seen that there's been an announcement that that's going to be extended to March 22, which is very good news. It gives some future visibility to justify investment. But anyway, we're going to start with a quick recap of the eligible measures, then have a look at building regs, technical approvals and other requirements, what it means in practice, and Ron will then go through the question of training and competence. So eligible measures, just as a recap, primary measures include solid wall, cavity wall, underfloor, loft, flat roof, rimming roof and park home insulation. There are some secondary measures that are triggered by the installation of a primary measure. Just to note, there are two elements of the scheme, and the local authority delivery element is not restricted to the same primary measures. It can include, for example, new or replacement boilers. We're obviously focusing on the insulation measures, and those sort of the main primary measure, but we're not looking at the micro generation, heat pumps, etc. Measures. So, what is the landscape for the standards that products need to meet in order to be eligible for Green Homes grant funding? Well, there's a number of criteria established by different requirements. Firstly, there's the building regulations and approved document 7. There are then the technical approvals for the actual product or system that's involved, including in some cases manufacturers' guidance, etc., etc. There are also industry requirements, for example, those set by guarantee schemes. The IAA, as a condition of the guarantee scheme, for example, requires that all work is submitted for independent surveillance of the pre-installation building inspection under PAS 2030. And the funding schemes themselves can set rules for what products are eligible. There are also some other considerations that are not mentioned, for example, planning constraints, Party Wall Act, etc., etc. But we're kind of focusing on the main technical approvals. So, firstly, building regulations. What do they actually require? Well, obviously, it's a legal requirement to comply with the building regs, and therefore is required for Green Homes grant. But as the grant only applies to England, it's effectively the English building regulations that we're focusing on. These define building work that falls under the regulations as broadly anything that involves changing a substantial proportion of an element in a building as part of an upgrade. Where the work is covered, then there's a requirement for it to be notified to building control with an application. Alternatively, the work needs to be completed under a competent person scheme, such as the cavity wall scheme that the IAA operates. Where work does fall under the building regs, then depending on the measure, there are various routes to demonstrate compliance and various approved documents that can be followed in order to comply. So, for example, ADL includes a requirement for the U value to meet a target value. Regulation 7 covers standards of materials, but is actually not terribly helpful because it just says that adequate and proper materials should be used. And for example, cites CE marking as a way of evidencing the use of adequate and proper materials. Other requirements that are relevant to some measures, for example, external wall, internal wall would be approved document B and fire, approved document A, wind loading, etc. And that is the core requirement in order to comply with the building regulations, which are not prescriptive. So there are different ways that you can demonstrate compliance, but the key obligation is to make sure that you do comply. So what standards do systems or products have to hold in order to demonstrate that they can satisfy the building regulations? Well, there's a range of technical approvals, 3 of which are commonly encountered. The first is CE marking, which is kind of the absolute minimum for a product to be placed on the market. It doesn't really say anything about a particular application. It just covers the performance of the product. But moving on, the most common technical approval for insulation measures, particularly systems, is an Agrément certificate issued by an independent testing body, such as the BBA or Kiwa. There are also European standards, particularly HENS and ETAs, and these outline the tests that are covered in the CE marking declaration of performance, but they don't usually apply to a particular administration. So, for example, they don't necessarily evidence compliance with the UK building regulations, and that usually requires a further independent technical assessment in order for that standard to be relied on. Now, the type of technical approval determines what specific requirements apply to the way the work is designed and undertaken. And starting at the kind of the minimum, as mentioned, CE marking is really just evidence that a product's performance is consistent with the manufacturer's self-declared declaration of performance, usually assessed according to a harmonized European methodology, i.e. an ETA or a HEN. They're not usually specific to a particular application, but there should be manufacturer's guidance for using a particular product in a particular application, for example, underfloor insulation. The key thing is it doesn't necessarily provide evidence that a particular product is suitable for a particular use, or that it even helps satisfy the building regulations. So that needs to be evidenced in other ways. Just as a note, due to Brexit, CE marking is due to be replaced by the UCTA mark, which I think after a transitional period comes in January 22 from memory. So that's fine where you've got a simple product, for example, loft insulation. You need to know the performance. There's guidance on how it should be used for that particular application available from the manufacturer. What happens though where you've got a more complex measure? Well, as I mentioned, more complex measures and systems are usually covered by an Agrément certificate. Key thing about an Agrément certificate, it provides an independent opinion of the fitness of purpose of a system or product for a specific application. And it's based on assessment of the performance and the various requirements, including safety, installation, durability, and other essential characteristics. It's usually based on testing of a solution, and typically that involves the insulation and other prescribed components. It's also backed by an assessment of the production process and also surveillance of the actual installation work being undertaken, and may require the use of approved installers in order to comply with the technical approval. As an Agrément certificate is usually specific to an application, so for example cavity wall or external wall, they would also usually identify any constraints on the type of building or the specific applications that the product or system is suitable for. For example, buildings above 12 meters, exposure to wind-driven rain, an item such as that would usually be specified in the Agrément certificate. As mentioned, that there's a number of factors that are considered, including safety, performance, durability, fire, water resistance, condensation, and they may impose particular requirements on how the work is done. I mentioned audits of production, system designer training for technicians, and carding of technicians for some measures. A requirement for system designers to approve installers to use their system, i.e. to check that they're actually competent to use the system correctly. There can be requirements to oversee the work of individual technicians. And then are also various detailed requirements with respect to the design. For example, cavity wall drill patterns, pre-installation assessment requirements, reinforcing patches on external wall, etc. So Agrément certificates have quite a key position in many of the insulation measures that are likely to be involved in Green Homes Grant. But in addition, as mentioned, there are some other requirements that are imposed on products and the installation work. Individual funding schemes may require particular criteria. For example, installers being Trustmark registered in the case of Green Homes Grant. And there is also industry, both guidance, best practice guides, and guarantee schemes that also establish criteria against which products are assessed. I suppose one of the key points, the IAA, as part of the membership process for suppliers, does check that they hold the correct technical approvals and they have the necessary technical resources to support installing businesses to meet the requirements of the building regs and funding schemes. And that ensures that the products and systems they're supplying meet all the required standards. So it simplifies and reduces the risk for contractors if they use material sourced from an IAA member rather than the nearest shed. So what does it all kind of mean in practice? Well, the key distinction is whether it's a product or whether it's a third-party tested and assessed system. If it's a system, it would usually have, as I mentioned, a technical approval based on an Agrément certificate, and that compares with products that typically would just be covered by CE marking and manufacturer's technical guidance. But it's not entirely clean, and there are, for example, underfloor and loft insulation systems, usually some sort of sprayed system. And they are used, although products, for example, mineral wool quilt, account for the majority of the actual work that's delivered under the schemes such as Eco and Green Homes Grant. So to run through it, a systemised measure such as cavity wall insulation, because it's subject to an Agrément certificate and the requirements that imposes, means there should be an endorsement of the application for certification and membership endorsed by the system designer, and that's basically to ensure that the right training and checks of competence have been undertaken. Also, in terms of best practice guidance for all these measures, there is a requirement to comply with IAA or industry best practice guidance, etc., etc. Taking a simpler measure, loft insulation, there isn't a requirement for system-specific training. Generic training is accepted. Supplier endorsement of installer applications for certification is still preferred, but is not essential and can be undertaken or covered by additional IAA checks. Just one point to note, we'll cover it in a later module, but under PAS 2035, which is the design, the new design specification, work or projects are assigned to one of a number of risk pathways, and that is based on various factors, including the inherent technical risk of the measure itself. So, for example, IWI is high risk, whereas cavity wall is a slightly lower risk. Where you have a systemized measure and where it's subject to a quality assurance framework, you can actually reduce the inherent technical risk by 1. Point about that is, by reducing the technical risk, you potentially reduce the rigor of the pathway that needs to be followed, and that yields compliance cost advantages, i.e. it costs less to actually deliver in terms of PAS 2035, where you're using a fully systemized product. I probably should mention there are some solid wall solutions that, instead of having an Agrément certificate, have a technical approval based on the European standard, but they would usually require, as mentioned, additional evidence of how they contribute to meeting the building regs. That's really the very quick run through of product standards. So in practical terms, what's the journey? What are the key things to actually check? Well, the first one, I guess, is it depends which measures are potentially of interest. As mentioned, product, for example, loft insulation, is a little bit less challenging because there isn't the requirement for manufacturer training, etc. So the first thing is to identify what measures are of interest. Secondly, identify IAA registered suppliers, because then you know the products have been vetted to make sure they hold the correct technical approvals. If it's a system, then you need to arrange for supplier training and endorsement of an application for certification. Obviously, then once all that's in place and you're certified, work has to be completed in accordance with the relevant technical approval, the IAA requirements, trust mark requirements, industry best practice, etc., etc. So that's kind of the journey and the main checks to make. Ron is now going to quickly run through the question of competence and how that is actually evidenced. So Ron, over to you.
Thank you, Jerry. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ron Fennick. I'm the head of certification for the IAA. So having looked at the product standards, what are the competency requirements to install these products? They are largely established by the requirements of PAS 2030, although building regulations and technical approvals also set criteria for technical competence. The following slides will go into the competence requirements to work within the Green Homes Grant Scheme. So competence requirements. Building regulations just require that installations are completed within a workmanlike manner. But where work is completed under the Competent Person Scheme, the conditions of authorization require that operatives satisfy minimum technical competence for the measures involved. Additionally, more prescriptive competence requirements are established in a number of ways. Competence Person Scheme, in which there is a minimum technical competence requirements, CE markings, HENs and ETAs. These may also specify competence requirements. Agrément certificates. These usually specify the use of approved installers, including the requirements that technicians are trained and approved by the certified holder to install the specific system. And most importantly, PAS 2030 and Trustmark framework operating requirements. European technical approvals and Agrément certificates include competency requirements to ensure correct performance. PAS 2030 defines competence in two ways, depending on the edition. Under PAS 2030-17, competence requirements require that technicians must meet minimum technical competence as per the Competent Person Scheme, and additionally define the competence ratio for the teams. Under PAS 2030-19, the requirement is for the technicians to hold or to be working towards a recognised NVQ for that measure. So how is this usually evidenced? There is an MTC, minimum technical competence, available for most building works, and as shown as a broad scope of the MTC for underfloor insulation. Each category includes detailed requirements. For example, knowledge of the types of information involves understanding of areas such as installation drawings, specifications, schedules, work records, method statements, risk assessments, manufacturer's information, and assessment of existing services and ventilation requirements, etc. So, to how the Competence Landscape actually looks like. Installer and system designer training needs to be mapped to MTCs and to the NOS, National Occupation Standards, if used to support towards NVQ status. As you can see from the diagram, all routes point towards PAS 2030-19 compliance. However, within audit of your company, and if it's identified that you are PAS 2030-17 compliant under the current dispensation, you will be allowed to install and lodge within the Green Home Grant Scheme currently up to the 31st of March 2021. And that brings us to the end of the presentation and on to your questions.